The sound wasn't a gunshot, not at first, but a violent compression of air that punched inward and rattled the bones of my inner ear. It registered in my body before my mind had time to assign meaning, sharp and invasive, like something tearing through the space around me. My head snapped up from the sprinkler head in my hands as instinct erased routine and replaced it with threat recognition. Training flooded in without permission, stripping emotion away and leaving only angles, distance, and direction. I identified the round before fear arrived, a .22 fired subsonic from close range, careless and amateur. The thin crack dissolved almost immediately into the humid afternoon, too weak to echo but strong enough to matter. Then another sound followed, one that ignored every layer of discipline I had ever built. It was my daughter's voice, a sharp gasp torn out of her chest and cut short by pain. My body moved before thought caught up, already low, already scanning, already committing to motion. This was my home. This was my child, and the rules of engagement changed in that instant. Before we move forward, drop a comment. Where are you watching from? I reached her near the old oak at the edge of our property, the one that had marked the boundary long before any HOA map ever existed, and she was crumpled in the grass like gravity had betrayed her. Her face was drained of color, eyes wide and unfocused, trying to understand why her body no longer obeyed her. Blood spread across the denim of her left leg, just below the knee, dark and steady, the kind of flow that doesn't wait for permission. The father in me surged forward, screaming, clawing for control, but the professional slammed the door shut and took over because panic kills faster than bullets. I dropped beside her and spoke softly, forcing calm into my voice even as something inside me fractured. Her eyes locked onto mine, searching for certainty, and I gave it to her because she needed that more than comfort. The entry wound was small and deceptively clean, a neat hole that lied about how serious the damage was. I ran my fingers down the back of her calf and found the exit, wider, torn, confirming what I already knew. The bone was spared, but the rhythm of the bleeding told me the truth I didn't want to hear. An artery was involved, not fully severed, but compromised enough to put us on a clock, measured in minutes. Time collapsed into a narrow tunnel where nothing existed except my hands, her leg, and the need to stop the flow. I stripped the belt from my waist and looped it high on her thigh without hesitation. I pulled it tight enough to make her cry out and ignored the sound because stopping meant losing her. I grabbed a fallen branch, thick enough to hold, slid it beneath the belt, and twisted. Once, twice, 3 times, until resistance fought back and the bleeding slowed, then stopped. Only then did I allow myself to breathe, just enough to confirm she was still conscious, still with me. I told her to keep looking at me, to stay here, to listen to my voice. I promised her help was coming, not as reassurance but as fact. Then I looked up. Across the manicured stretch of lawn separating our properties, HOA Karen stood on her porch. She wasn't shaking, wasn't screaming, wasn't panicked. She was dressed neatly, silver hair perfect, posture straight, as if she were waiting for a delivery instead of standing over the result of a gunshot. In her hands was a small pistol, held steady, confident, familiar. Her face carried irritation, not horror, and that detail burned itself into me harder than anything else. When she spoke, her voice cut cleanly through the air, sharp and sterile. She said my daughter had been trespassing on HOA property. The words didn't make sense at first, not because I didn't hear them, but because my brain rejected them as impossible. A 10-year-old chasing a soccer ball had been answered with a bullet, justified by a line on a map. The insanity of it pressed down on me, heavy and suffocating, but I didn't let it show. I pulled my phone from my pocket without breaking eye contact and dialed emergency services. My voice flattened into the tone I used when reporting hostile incidents overseas, precise and controlled. I gave the address, identified the injury as a gunshot wound, described the victim, and demanded immediate response. I described the shooter, the weapon, and confirmed she was still on scene. I let a brief silence stretch before finishing the call, stating calmly that she had just made the final mistake of her life. I ended the call and stayed where I was, positioned between my daughter and the woman who shot her. HOA Karen didn't lower the gun, didn't apologize, didn't retreat. She looked annoyed, as if the situation had inconvenienced her afternoon. Sirens began to wail in the distance, faint at first, then growing louder, but she didn't react to them either. The calmness in her posture told me something important. This wasn't panic. This wasn't an accident. This was entitlement colliding with consequence. As we waited, my mind moved through possibilities with brutal efficiency. I cataloged what had already happened and what would happen next, not out of hope, but out of necessity. I knew the police would arrive and treat this like a misunderstanding if they were allowed to. I knew words like accidental discharge and property dispute would be floated to soften the edges. I also knew I couldn't allow that narrative to take hold. The evidence was already there, written in blood and recorded in timestamps and emergency calls. This moment would define everything that followed. The sirens finally cut into the street, sharp and unavoidable, and HOA Karen's expression shifted for the first time. Not fear, but calculation. She lowered the weapon slowly and set it on a table beside her, rehearsed and deliberate. I stayed where I was, one hand still on the tourniquet, the other resting visibly in my lap. When the officers arrived, I spoke when asked and only when asked, answering questions with clarity and restraint. I watched HOA Karen try to frame the situation with the same calm authority she used on her neighbors, and I watched it fail to land. As the paramedics loaded my daughter onto the stretcher, she reached for my hand and squeezed it weakly. I squeezed back and told her she was doing great, that she was strong, that she was safe. The words mattered less than my presence, and I stayed with her until they took her inside the ambulance. Only then did I turn back toward the house she had been shot from. HOA Karen stood surrounded by officers now, her voice raised, her confidence cracking at the edges. She was still talking about HOA boundaries. In that moment, standing in the wreckage of what she had done, I understood something with absolute clarity. This was not the end of a dispute. This was the beginning of a collapse. The shot she fired didn't just tear through my daughter's leg. It tore open everything she had been hiding behind, and she had no idea how far this was about to go. The house on Chestnut Drive was never just a place I slept, and it was never a decorative investment meant to appreciate quietly while life happened elsewhere. It was a promise made concrete, a structure built with intent long before anyone decided to draw HOA lines across the neighborhood. My father raised it himself in the 70s, back when the land was open and the rules were simple. He believed in boundaries that could be seen, doors that could be secured, and the idea that if you owned something, you protected it. That house outlived him, outlasted every zoning revision that followed, and became the one fixed point I could return to when everything else fell apart. When my wife died, the world contracted violently, and every priority I thought I understood was exposed as temporary. I was left with a 6-year-old daughter and a career that demanded I disappear into places where people didn't come home intact. There was no internal debate, no dramatic crossroads. I walked away from the job because the job was optional and my daughter wasn't. I didn't retire to relax. I retired to take responsibility for the one thing that mattered, and that decision shaped everything that followed. For most of my adult life, my work revolved around anticipating violence before it announced itself. I was trained to identify threat patterns, pressure points, and the difference between noise and intent. My world was layered with contingencies, redundancies, and planning that assumed failure would happen unless actively prevented. I didn't respond to danger after it arrived. I built systems so it never had the chance. That mindset doesn't shut off when you change addresses. It becomes part of how you breathe. To the neighborhood, I was just Mark, the quiet father who traveled for consulting work and kept his lawn trimmed. People waved, exchanged pleasantries, and filled in the blanks with whatever made them comfortable. I let them. Peace depends on anonymity, and I had no interest in being anything more than invisible. The normalcy was intentional, a controlled environment designed to give my daughter a life untouched by the things I had seen. I wasn't hiding. I was containing. When Northwood Estates first welcomed us, it looked exactly like what it advertised. Clean streets, orderly homes, and a homeowners association that promised consistency. I read every covenant and bylaw before we unpacked, not because I enjoyed rules, but because understanding the framework mattered. Most of the restrictions were superficial, easy to live with if they bought stability. Fence heights, approved colors, trash schedules. None of it threatened my priorities. And for a while, The system functioned without friction. My daughter thrived there. She rode her bike down the cul-de-sac without fear, made friends whose parents trusted the illusion of safety, and filled the house with a kind of light I thought had been extinguished forever. I kept my head down, exchanged polite nods, and avoided anything that resembled attention. That balance held until control became more important to someone else than peace. The first crack appeared when I upgraded the house's security. Not visibly, not provocatively, but deliberately. I integrated discrete cameras, buried sensors, and reinforced access points in ways that complied with every aesthetic rule the HOA enforced. To anyone driving by, the house looked unchanged. Functionally, it was hardened, because that's what you do when you understand risk. I didn't announce it. I didn't seek approval. I simply ensured my daughter slept behind systems that worked. HOA Karen noticed when her husband's landscaping crew tried to cut across my lawn and triggered an automated warning. The complaint arrived a week later, dressed up in official language and vague authority. She cited unauthorized modifications and demanded compliance. I responded the only way that ever works with people like her, with precision. I referenced statutes, precedents, and the exact limits of HOA authority, not emotionally, but conclusively. That exchange ended the moment it began, and she knew it. From that point forward, the tone shifted. The notices became more frequent, the violations more creative. A basketball hoop was suddenly a problem. Grill smoke offended community standards. Imaginary infractions appeared on official letterhead. Each one was answered calmly, documented meticulously, and filed away. I wasn't pushing back to win. I was building a record, the same way I would with any hostile entity testing boundaries. People like HOA Karen don't tolerate resistance. They escalate when authority is questioned, not because they're right, but because control is their identity. I had seen that pattern play out in places where the consequences were measured in casualties instead of fines. The only difference here was the setting, not the psychology. I recognized the trajectory early and understood it wouldn't end with paperwork. It never does. I never imagined the escalation would involve a gun, but escalation doesn't ask for permission or care about imagination. It follows its own logic until something stops it. HOA. Karen believed she was entitled to obedience because a title had protected her before. She mistook silence for agreement and compliance for legitimacy. By the time she pulled that trigger, she had already convinced herself she was untouchable. What she didn't understand was that she wasn't dealing with a neighbor who would fold under pressure or retreat to avoid inconvenience. She was dealing with someone who had spent a lifetime dismantling threats that believed exactly what she believed. And while I had chosen peace for my daughter, I had never abandoned the ability to enforce it. Northwood Estates didn't run on fairness or consensus, no matter how carefully the newsletters pretended otherwise. It ran on fatigue. The rules were written to look neutral, but the enforcement was selective, targeted, and quietly cruel. HOA Karen understood something most people never articulate. You don't need everyone to agree with you if you can make resistance more expensive than submission. Over time, the association stopped being a governing body and became an instrument for pressure, one that rewarded obedience and punished visibility. The absence of open revolt wasn't proof of harmony. It was proof that the system worked exactly as designed. HOA Karen's authority wasn't loud, but it was constant. She controlled the flow of notices, the interpretation of bylaws, and the speed at which violations escalated. A warning could linger for months if the homeowner was compliant, or it could turn into fines and legal threats within days if someone pushed back. Meetings were procedural theater, filled with jargon and circular discussion that exhausted anyone who tried to challenge her. By the time a resident realized they were being targeted, they were already buried under deadlines, fees, and the quiet suggestion that fighting would only make things worse. Most neighbors adapted. They learned when to nod, when to apologize, and when to stay invisible. Small humiliations were accepted as the cost of living there. A flagpole removed, a fence repainted, a garden torn out because it didn't match an approved palette. None of it seemed catastrophic on its own, and that was the point. The system wasn't built to break people all at once. It was built to wear them down until compliance felt like relief. HOA Karen thrived in that environment because it validated her identity. She didn't just enforce rules, she embodied them. The line between her personal authority and the HOA's institutional power blurred until it disappeared entirely. She spoke as if the association were an extension of her will, and over time, most people stopped distinguishing between the two. Contractors deferred to her. Board members echoed her language. Even local officials treated her complaints as if they carried more weight than they should have. Power compounds when no one interrupts it. The abuse sharpened when someone refused to play along. Challenges were met with disproportionate response, not because the violation mattered, but because defiance did. A minor issue became a cascade of inspections. A question at a meeting triggered weeks of follow-up letters. The message was clear without ever being stated outright. You can live here peacefully, or you can be right, but you can't be both. That choice forced most people into silence. I watched this dynamic unfold long before it turned its full attention toward me. I saw neighbors who once spoke freely begin to avoid eye contact. I saw properties change hands quietly after months of unexplained stress. No one talked about it openly because everyone assumed they were alone. That isolation was another tool, reinforcing the belief that resistance was individual, not collective. When my responses to HOA Karen's notices didn't bend, the pattern intensified. The tone hardened. The scrutiny narrowed. Her attention shifted from general oversight to personal fixation. She wasn't enforcing rules anymore. She was asserting dominance. Each letter carried less substance and more threat, and each one revealed how much she needed to win. The association's processes became weapons aimed at a single address. What made it dangerous was how normal it all looked from the outside. There were no shouting matches, no public scenes, no obvious cruelty. Everything arrived in envelopes and emails, wrapped in policy language that masked intent. That veneer of legitimacy protected her, because it discouraged outsiders from looking too closely. Abuse doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it hides behind procedure. By the time the pressure escalated beyond paperwork, the trajectory was already set. Administrative power had been pushed as far as it could go without breaking. HOA Karen had spent years learning that escalation worked, that people folded, that authority expanded when tested. When it finally failed against someone who didn't retreat, the system she relied on offered no breaks. It only pointed forward. The shooting didn't come out of nowhere. It was the logical endpoint of a structure that rewarded control and punished resistance without accountability. HOA Karen didn't suddenly become dangerous. She had been dangerous for years, protected by a system that mistook order for justice and obedience for peace. The moment she realized her usual tools no longer worked, she reached for something that couldn't be appealed or delayed. That was the nature of the abuse. It wasn't chaotic, it was systematic, and once it crossed into violence, there was no pretending it was anything else. The hospital stripped everything down to function, which suited me. White walls, clipped voices, the rhythm of machines that did exactly what they were designed to do. The surgeon told me the bullet had missed the artery by less than a millimeter, and that my daughter would recover with time and therapy. He called it fortunate. I called it survivable. Survival didn't reduce the severity of what had happened, and it didn't soften what came next. It simply meant I had the space to ensure this would never be minimized, reframed, or buried under polite language. The first layer of proof began there, not with outrage, but with documentation. Medical reports, timestamps, imaging, and written assessments created a clinical record that could not be argued with later. A gunshot wound isn't subjective. It doesn't become an accident because someone says it loudly enough. Every entry into the chart fixed the incident in reality, and I made sure nothing was omitted, nothing summarized, nothing softened for convenience. Precision mattered because narratives form fastest when facts are vague. Once my daughter was stable, I opened my laptop and began mapping the structure that had produced this moment. I wasn't guessing. I was confirming. Public records are honest if you read them long enough, and people who abuse authority leave patterns whether they realize it or not. The HOA's filings with the state told a story immediately. Leadership positions overlapped with family relationships in ways that were too neat to be coincidence. Titles rotated, but control stayed inside the same circle. That wasn't governance, it was consolidation. Financial disclosures added another layer. Landscaping contracts, maintenance agreements, and construction approvals repeated the same names, the same companies, the same inflated numbers. The association paid premium rates for services that should have been routine, and those payments flowed predictably back toward the people signing off on them. No single line item looked criminal on its own, but together they formed a pattern of extraction. Money moved in loops, not lines, and loops exist for one reason. Property records completed the picture. I traced ownership changes back over a decade and watched the same scenario play out again and again. A homeowner would receive a sudden wave of violations. Fines would stack quickly. Liens would appear faster than expected. Pressure would mount until the property changed hands below market value. The buyer, almost every time, was a shell entity that led back to the same small network. Houses didn't just change owners. They were harvested. The human cost was impossible to ignore once the names surfaced. Families who had complied until compliance wasn't enough. People who assumed rules applied evenly until they discovered enforcement had a target. Some had moved quietly to avoid embarrassment. Others had fought and lost because they ran out of money or time. Their experiences weren't dramatic in isolation, but together they formed a consistent narrative of coercion. The HOA didn't just maintain property values, it created leverage and applied it selectively. Digital correspondence reinforced everything. Emails, notices, and internal memos showed how language shifted depending on who was being addressed. Polite reminders for some, urgent demands for others. Deadlines accelerated, tone hardened. When authority was questioned, procedure turned sharp. It was all there, archived and time-stamped, a record of intent disguised as administration. The same voice appeared everywhere, guiding decisions while pretending to represent consensus. Witness accounts filled the remaining gaps. Former board members, contractors, and residents described the same behaviors independently, using different words but arriving at the same conclusions. They spoke carefully, even after leaving, because intimidation has a long half-life. I didn't rely on any single statement. I layered them, cross-checking details until inconsistencies disappeared. Truth doesn't require enthusiasm. It only requires alignment. By the time I closed that file, the shooting no longer stood alone. It sat at the end of a long, straight line, drawn by entitlement and protected by structure. HOA Karen hadn't snapped. She had escalated along a path that had rewarded her every step of the way. The evidence didn't just support that conclusion, it demanded it. At that point, discovery was complete, and proof no longer needed interpretation. It was ready to be introduced to daylight, where authority collapses quickly when it has nowhere left to hide. HOA Karen didn't retreat after the shooting, because retreat had never been part of her vocabulary. Silence from authorities read to her as validation, and validation hardened into confidence. Within days, official notices began arriving again, as if a child hadn't been carried away on a stretcher from the front lawn. The language was colder now, sharper, stripped of pretense. Emergency assessments were announced. Special meetings were scheduled. Accusations were reframed as community safety concerns, with my name positioned carefully as the destabilizing factor. She wasn't reacting to what she'd done. She was trying to finish what she'd started. The meeting notice arrived while my daughter was still learning to put weight back on her leg. It was delivered with performative efficiency, stamped and signed, calling for an executive session to address dangerous conduct and non-compliance. The amount attached to the assessment was large enough to break most families, and that was the point. She wanted exhaustion, panic, and surrender, all wrapped in procedural legitimacy. She believed the room would tilt toward her once the language of authority filled the space. She believed wrong. The clubhouse filled early that night. Neighbors arrived tense, uncertain, carrying the same unease they'd carried for years, but never spoken out loud. Whoa. Karen stood at the front, composed and rehearsed, flanked by familiar faces that had always nodded on cue. She opened with a speech about standards and safety, about protecting property values from disruption. She referenced the shooting obliquely, framing it as an unfortunate incident provoked by non-compliance. Her voice carried confidence built on repetition, the same cadence she'd used to bend rooms before. She expected the ritual to hold. I let her speak without interruption. Timing matters when authority is about to collapse. When she called for the vote, when the room was primed to comply out of habit, I stood. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't argue her framing. I changed the subject entirely. I activated the projector and turned the wall behind her into a record of her own making. The first image was simple, a chart connecting names and roles. HOA positions aligned neatly with family ties, the pattern obvious even to those who didn't want to see it. Then came contracts, inflated numbers highlighted, vendor names repeating with mechanical consistency. Property records followed, addresses scrolling past as the same shell entity appeared again and again. I walked the room through it slowly, explaining nothing that couldn't be verified. Dates, transfers, liens, sales. Each slide tightened the room, the air growing heavy as recognition replaced fear. The shift was visible. People leaned forward. Whispers started. Eyes moved from the screen to HOA Karen and back again, recalibrating everything they thought they understood. She tried to interrupt, tried to reassert control with volume, but volume doesn't matter when credibility is gone. Her objections sounded shrill against the calm rhythm of documented fact. The board members beside her stopped nodding. One of them looked down at the table and didn't look back up. When I addressed her directly, it wasn't as an adversary but as a subject of record. I stated plainly that the meeting was no longer about compliance. It was about exposure. The language she'd used to intimidate had become evidence, and evidence doesn't negotiate. I told the room that the shooting wasn't an isolated incident, that it was the endpoint of a system built to coerce and extract. I didn't ask for outrage. I let the truth do the work. The room broke in stages. Questions erupted, not from me, but from neighbors who had never spoken in these meetings before. Demands for explanations followed, calls for independent audits, motions to suspend authority. HOA Karen tried to regain the floor and failed. Every attempt to speak only deepened the collapse, each word confirming what the evidence already showed. Control drained out of her posture, replaced by something raw and frantic. By the time the meeting ended, nothing resembled the order she had relied on for years. The vote never happened. It didn't need to. Residents stayed behind, forming clusters, comparing experiences, realizing they hadn't been alone after all. Board members slipped out, quietly. HOA Karen stood apart, isolated in the space she once commanded, surrounded by people who no longer feared her. The collapse didn't end there. Calls went out before the chairs were stacked. Journalists asked questions she couldn't answer. Regulators requested documents she couldn't control. The authority she wielded publicly evaporated in a single evening, replaced by scrutiny that could not be deflected or delayed. She left that building smaller than she'd entered it, stripped of the performance that had protected her. That night marked the point of no return. What had been private certainty became public fact, and once that threshold's crossed, there is no way back. The confrontation wasn't loud, and it wasn't violent, but it was absolute. From that moment forward, HOA Karen was no longer the one setting deadlines or issuing demands. She was reacting, and reaction is the posture of someone who has already lost. Once the public collapse occurred, the conflict moved out of the emotional phase and into the mechanical one, which was where I operated best. Panic creates noise, and noise creates mistakes. HOA Karen began making those mistakes immediately. Emails went unanswered, records went missing, and contradictory statements started circulating as she tried to regain footing. That chaos didn't slow me down. It accelerated the process, because retaliation at this stage wasn't reactive. It was structured, methodical, and already in motion. I separated personal consequence from systemic dismantling, because conflating the two weakens both. The first priority was ensuring my daughter's safety permanently, not symbolically. Protective measures were expanded quietly, redundancies layered so deeply that no single failure could ever create exposure again. Legal boundaries were reinforced in ways that required no permission and no explanation. I didn't announce those changes because deterrence works best when it's invisible. Security is strongest when it doesn't need to prove itself. The second priority was ensuring HOA Karen could never again operate behind ambiguity. Regulatory agencies were contacted with complete packages, not complaints. Financial regulators received documented trails. Civil authorities received corroborated timelines. Each submission stood on its own, capable of surviving scrutiny without my presence. That was intentional. Systems collapse faster when they don't depend on a single voice. I wasn't positioning myself as a crusader. I was removing myself entirely from the equation and letting institutions do what they're designed to do when given clear inputs. The retaliation wasn't loud, because loud actions invite sympathy. It wasn't rushed, because haste creates vulnerabilities. It unfolded across weeks, each step compounding pressure without spectacle. Insurance carriers withdrew coverage, legal counsel resigned, auditors widened their scope. Each development forced HOA Karen into defensive posture after defensive posture, draining resources and credibility simultaneously. She spent her time reacting to letters, deadlines, and subpoenas, while I spent mine returning my life to routine. What mattered most was that the retaliation never mirrored her behavior. There were no threats, no ultimatums, no public taunts. Everything moved through formal channels with a level of discipline she had never anticipated. She had built her authority on intimidation and assumed conflict would follow the same pattern. It didn't. It followed process, and process is merciless when stripped of favoritism. Neighbors began to speak openly as the pressure mounted. Stories surfaced without prompting, now that fear no longer governed silence. Each account added weight, not because it was dramatic, but because it aligned. Patterns don't need embellishment. They need consistency, and consistency was everywhere. What she had controlled through isolation dissolved through collective clarity. By the time enforcement actions were initiated, there was no room left for narrative manipulation. Facts had replaced framing. Documentation replaced authority. The retaliation reached its endpoint not with a dramatic moment, but with a quiet inevitability. Positions were vacated. Powers were suspended. Access was revoked. The structure that had protected her simply stopped responding to her commands. Expert retaliation isn't about punishment. It's about removal. Removing the ability to cause harm. Removing access to leverage. Removing the illusion of control. When done correctly, it leaves nothing to argue with and nothing to appeal emotionally. It doesn't humiliate. It nullifies. By the time HOA Karen understood that distinction, there was nothing left for her to influence, and nothing left for her to threaten. The aftermath didn't arrive with applause or relief. It arrived quietly, the way permanent change always does, after the noise has exhausted itself, and there's nothing left to contest. HOA Karen didn't issue a final statement or attempt a last performance. Her name simply stopped appearing on notices, emails, and agendas. Authority didn't transfer dramatically. It dissolved, leaving behind empty titles and abandoned processes that no one rushed to reclaim. The association entered a holding pattern almost immediately. Meetings were canceled, then rescheduled under interim supervision. Committees dissolved quietly. The language shifted from enforcement to compliance, from demands to clarification. Residents noticed the difference without needing it explained. The pressure that had hovered over daily life lifted, not because it was celebrated, but because it was gone. Silence returned to the neighborhood, not the tense kind, but the ordinary kind that doesn't carry threat. My daughter healed in parallel with that change. The physical recovery was measured and patient, each step forward deliberate. The fear took longer, but it loosened its grip as routine reasserted itself. She returned to the yard, then the sidewalk, then the space where the line had once been enforced by intimidation. No one told her it was safe again. She decided that for herself, and that decision mattered more than reassurance. There were no follow-up conversations with HOA Karen, no confrontations, no closure rituals. She didn't apologize. She didn't explain. She receded, absorbed into the consequences of her own actions without ceremony. That absence was more definitive than any statement could have been. People who rely on control rarely understand how quickly they become irrelevant once it's removed. The house on Chestnut Drive remained what it had always been, unchanged and unmoved by the conflict that passed through it. The systems in place continued functioning without attention, doing exactly what they were built to do. Life resumed without commentary. Neighbors waved again, not out of caution, but out of habit. The neighborhood didn't need a villain anymore. It didn't need a lesson either. Victory didn't look like vindication. It looked like normal mornings, unremarkable afternoons, and evenings without interruption. It looked like walking the property line without thinking about it. It looked like the absence of authority where it never should have existed. Nothing was repaired publicly, because nothing needed to be performed. HOA Karen didn't return. She didn't challenge the outcome. She didn't test boundaries again. She vanished from relevance, which was the only ending that fit. There was no satisfaction in watching that happen. Only confirmation that control fails when it meets resistance that doesn't need permission. The last notice issued under her name was never retracted. It simply expired, unanswered and unenforced, like everything else she once believed was permanent. The system corrected itself without fanfare, and no one argued after that.